We are now in the unquestionable part of the day. I am still Dan Wu. Our guest today is Howard Penn. Planning and conservation is his thing, and we're going to be talking about the Land and Water Conservation Fund, a nationally funded, a flow of money that comes from various places that funds acquisition of land all over the country to support parks, even some private lands that do recreation or public-private partnerships, federal land, state parks, creating new ones, and maintaining the ones that we have. And Howard Penn is described on his website as a philanthropreneur. We're going to get into that with him, find out what exactly he means by that term. We got Do Make Say Think in the background with 1978. You're listening to KZSE Santa Cruz. And welcome to the show, Howard. How's it going?
Good, Dan. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Hoping I got your introduction right. Did you want to add anything to that, or correct the name of your organization or anything?
Yeah, that was quite a lead-in. Thanks so much for that. Yes, the name of the organization is the Planning and Conservation League. We're based out of Sacramento, but we're a statewide environmental policy, land use, transportation, climate change organization. So we work on a number of environmental policies at the state capitol. We've been around since 1965. So we are one of the oldest statewide environmental organizations, and we spend a significant amount of our time at the state capitol working with legislators and administrative offices and staff members in influencing and hopefully directing good environmental policies throughout the state. And you were close on your definition off my bio. It's a philopreneur, and that's kind of a combination of a philanthropic and entrepreneur. And I got into that years ago when I was running tech companies and a management consulting firm in San Francisco. And most of my staff were all very philanthropic in their personal lives. And so we started doing a lot of nonprofit and outreach work with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits in San Francisco, and kind of merging the forward-thinking entrepreneurial spirit into the nonprofit sector. And so over the years of starting multiple nonprofits and serving on multiple nonprofit boards, I now, in my second career now in the advocacy environmental policy world, kind of consider myself a philanthropreneur, trying to bring new ideas and new ways of approaching policy as well as environmental legislation to the state capitol.
And just to kind of explore that term a little bit further, because I've never heard it before and I kind of get it, but entrepreneur means that you essentially start businesses to make money. How would you describe that in terms of its relationship to the word entrepreneur, as far as do you make money through your planning and conservation league?
Well, I think in the Bay Area, quite often the word entrepreneur often gets associated with a startup person that does startups to make money. But the actual orientation or the original origins of entrepreneur is somebody that actually is forward-thinking, that's progressive and taking something new and bringing it to people. So whether you're bringing a product to market to make money out of it, or you're bringing a new idea to a group of individuals to work on in the nonprofit sector or the government sector, as opposed to the private sector, somebody that's entrepreneurial with their approach is someone that's doing something in a different way to kind of be disruptive, just like the startup world in Silicon Valley needs to be disruptive to move technology forward into different types of vertical markets. In the nonprofit sector, you have to sometimes be disruptive to affect change. We're seeing that now with the Me Too movement. I would consider the women and the leaders of the Me Too movement entrepreneurs. These are individuals that are taking risks. They're taking their own personal and political capital and expending that in a way to make a a national and a global movement happen. And just because there's not a profit motive to that doesn't mean that those aren't entrepreneurial spirits making that happen. We see that across the political spectrum, whether that's judicial reform or environmental policies or social and civic issues like the Me Too movement. We've got Black Lives Matter, and we have other groups that are out there, working on different tax issues. These are all individuals that are trying to move the ball forward, so to say, kind of lean into it is another colloquialism we use nowadays. And to me, those are entrepreneurial people. So I understand the association with profit motive. That's not our motive. Planning and Conservation League is a not-for-profit or a nonprofit. So we're a 501c3, so we don't assume profits or we don't take on profits. However, it does take money to run Planning and Conservation League, as it takes money and resources to run any nonprofit. So we do rely on donations. We rely on grants. We rely on people supporting our work in order to be able to continue, hiring staff and paying for office space and everything that we have to do. So
you guys contacted someone was in contact with one of our few paid staff members here about a specific issue that the Planning and Conservation and Planning League is involved in, specifically right now pushing for a certain act to continue to be funded that is part of the federal government right now, and it's the Land and Water Conservation Fund.
Yeah.
And it's been around by my research for about 50 years, since 1964.
54. Yeah, it's been around since 1964, founded by during the administration of Lyndon B. Johnson, and then it was instituted in 1965 from an appropriations point of view, and they get started to fund it. So this fund has been around for 50 plus years, the Land and Water Conservation Fund.
Maybe tell the listeners a little bit about what it does in a way that you think the average person would understand, just because you work on this issue so much. I say that.
No, I appreciate that. Absolutely. We have to be careful about all the acronyms in any industry nowadays. So the Land and Water Conservation Fund was founded as a way to help promote and support and protect water and land conservation projects throughout the country. And these range from anywhere from the Pacific Crest Crest Trail to, Golden Gate National Recreation Area, to Lake Tahoe, to the Santa Monica Mountains, to the Santa Cruz Hills, all across the state, and all the counties throughout the state has received money from this fund over the last 54 years. Over $2.5 billion has been spent over the last 5 decades just in California. The fund funds projects throughout the United States, everywhere from national parks and national forests, all the way down to local parks in your community. So your local park in your neighborhood may have received some money from this fund when it was originally set up, or that land was acquired, or infrastructure was put in place on that park. It also helps fund beaches, and it helps fund conservation projects to protect ecosystems or wildlife in various places throughout the country and in California. So it has a very large spectrum of impacts that it has on our daily lives. And one of the things I like to talk to people about when they ask about the fund is that I bet that in any place that you've been to recreate, to go out and go for a walk or a hike or a bike ride or a swim in your life, I bet you there's something that this money has supported that you've taken advantage of. And this money comes from the offshore oil drilling licenses.
I wanted to maybe pause there for a second.
Sure.
And talk about the fact that since it's been around for about 54 years, and it's not, in my opinion, it's not solely secluded to this one issue, but it's one of those issues that people are writing about nowadays, saying that for decades both parties voted on this, and I wasn't able to find the actual vote total from 1964 on this, but that it was a bipartisan bill and that it was easily passed for decades, at least for a couple decades, and that in the last decade or so it's become a political football or something that people try to hold back to get other things going on. How can you describe the level of near universal support for this compared to what it is now? And can you describe what's going on and why you're bringing this to the attention of people right now?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Dan. You're absolutely right. For 50 plus years, this has been a bipartisan supported funding effort. It comes up every 3 years, 2 to 3 years for refunding. It has a sunset clause in it. One of the things we are currently asking for is for this to be permanently funded and not to have to renew this every 2 or 3 years. But at this particular juncture, we would be happy with a renewal of this fund since it's being contested or held up at this part. And so, yes, this has become a political football. Unfortunately, like many other public lands and conservation project funding in this current administration, many of these funding sources are being held up as leverage to get other things. We can just imagine, without getting into a lot of specifics, as to what those other things are that this current scenario or current administration would be looking for. So I think it's really important for people to realize that for the entire history of this fund, it has been very bipartisan, and it is currently very bipartisan. I mean, we've got 600 plus organizations across the country working on this right now to get Congress to pass this. And these are organizations everywhere from, hunting and fishing groups in Arkansas to, environmental groups in New England and Massachusetts and California that are working on this. So the impact of this funding is enormous. The outdoor recreation industry in the United States, which is it's the largest in the world. It's over $800+ billion a year in economic.
Right,
impact.
I read $887 billion.
Yeah, it's huge. Yeah, and this money helps support the places that industry and that economy depend on.
That includes preservation and places that are reserves, also places for snowboarding and, like you said, hunting and fishing and some, it's not just keeping this land, untouched. Exactly. A lot of it is also the ability of that money, that $887 billion that it creates in economic activity by some calculations includes all the business that happens in those places and all the equipment sold for people to go use in those areas and all of the people that service those areas and all the people that serve dinner to people while they're on a long drive to get to those places. And there's lots of things that this opens up economically. And I'm going to skip over the funding mechanism for a second because you brought up an interesting point about hunting and fishing. Because I found an article, Ryan Zinke, the current Interior Secretary. It's funny because a lot of the staunch Republican part, the Tea Party part of Congress right now that's often holding this up and wanting to let it expire, Ryan Zinke tends to agree with them on a lot of things, and he's running basically the Interior Department, which covers a lot of our parks and natural lands and everything. And I read an article that said that letting this expire, ironically, could hurt a lot of things that he said he wants to do, including maintaining and keeping open areas for hunting and fishing. And I find it kind of funny, kind of a little bit of schadenfreude, that he would then be shooting in the foot his own hunting and fishing initiatives by defunding this thing that funds and produces open lands to go hunting and fishing sometimes. Can you comment on how maybe some of the people that are opposing it might be shooting themselves in the foot for getting rid of this?
To tell you the truth, Dan, I really have no idea why the current administration likes to shoot themselves in the foot with this stuff. It doesn't make any sense. You were highlighting a very important part about what happens in our federal government and the administration internally, both in the Department of Interior and as well as in the executive branch, as part of the executive branch and in Congress. So I don't have an answer. Many of us often can explain some of the political football that's being played, and I could spend hours on the phone with you and your listeners talking about what actually happens behind the scenes in Congress when they're playing this football game. I was just out in D.C. a month and a half ago, working the Capitol, working with congressional members on a number of issues, this being one of them, as well as some other bills that are going through. And it's an ongoing, chess game. and it's gotten much, much more complicated in the past year and a half. So I don't actually have an answer for you as to why Zinke is doing this, other than the fact that his boss is probably telling him to do this, and I don't quite understand what the end objective is. There are Republicans and Democrats and independents and people from all walks of life and socioeconomic levels that are benefiting from the funding of this. And if you think about this, the offshore oil drilling is billions of dollars. I mean, it's well up over $10, $12, $14 billion a year, depending on the leases in a given year. And this fund gets anywhere between $500 to $900 million. So it's not even, it's a percentage of the oil and gas leases. And that money is divided up among all the states and territories. And so I feel that this is an important investment in our lands, that public lands and access to public lands like public beaches and public parks, whether it's a local city park or a county park or a state park or a national park, are all part of our national heritage. It's part of what makes America and Americans who we are. It's part of the land that we have grown up on over the decades and centuries. And it's extremely important for us to take care of it and to support it and to protect it for future generations. Not just for our own use today, which is important for our access to the outdoors and for the economic value of it, but also for the future generations. So.
And what would you say to when you're trying to get support for this bill? I've seen a lot of things about it expiring in 2015. I know you guys fought a lot in the last 10 years or so to keep this being renewed. It has been renewed at those other points, sometimes after a short or close to expiring, but it's going to expire on September 30th.
Yep.
Is there any opportunity for them to actually vote on this before September 30th, considering that Congress tends to have more days off than school children?
They have plenty of opportunity to vote on this. And the way that this type of the logistics of bills like this work is that much of that work is done by congressional staff members. I have to tell you that, a lot of the work that goes on in Congress and on the Hill, as we call it, or in the Capitol, the actual work is done by staffers. And they're amazing people that work very hard and extremely long hours. 99% of them are very young and don't get paid very much. And when I go out there and I meet with congressional staff members as well as Congress people, I'm always blown away as I get older how young many of the staffers are, because they don't pay very well, and so it doesn't attract people, later in their career track. So the process to get this bill done and in front of Congress to vote on is not complicated. It really is political right now, and most of that is being dealt with in ways. There's multiple bills up to vote to approve this. There's also additional bills to be able to make this permanent in the future. That's going to be a much harder one in the current environment to make it permanent. So we're just hoping to get it renewed. So, and any of your listeners that are interested in looking into this, there's a great website. It's LWCA, Land Water Conservation Fund, LWCF, Land Water Conservation Fund is what it stands for, .com or .org. Either domain name will work. And if you go to that website, there's a ton of information on what's happening right now, the bills that are being proposed, where this money has been spent. I'm looking at a list right now in front of me on Santa Cruz, starting all the way back in 1971 and earlier, 1969. There was an acquisition of the Twin Lake State Beach.
Oh yeah, that's my childhood neighborhood right there.
Okay,
I grew up 5 houses from that beach.
Oh really?
Yeah.
$131,000 in 1969 was used to help acquire that state beach. There's been things all the way in the 80s. There was another $300,000 or $405,000 to acquire the Castle Rock State Park.
Oh, nice.
Right there in Santa Cruz. So there's a whole list of projects and money. Millions of dollars have been spent in Santa Cruz from this fund over the last 50 years.
We also hit Monterey and San Benito County, so we can throw in some of those stats for them later in the show. We're going to take a quick break. I want to come back and continue the conversation with Howard Penn of the Planning and Conservation League. And we'll be back with more Unquestionable in just a moment. Thank you for listening. You got KZSE Santa Cruz in your ears right now. This is Unquestionable. We'll be back right after the concert calendar. We're back here on Unquestionable. I'm Dan Wu. All right, Howard, we're back, and we were just talking about how the Land and Water Conservation Fund has become a political football. And one of the things that often the people that are trying to hold this back and let it expire will say about many different things, not just this bill or this funding avenue, is that they're trying to save the government money. Now, you said that 10 to 14 billion is the revenue from leases on oil drilling, and this fund usually averages 500 to 900 million. You said I've seen 900 million, so you're saying 500 to 900 million. So that's about 5 to 8% of leases from the revenue from the leases that oil companies pay to drill offshore. Now, that's not their profits. That's the lease payments, right? They're making much more in profits, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, those are just the lease payments that they pay to use the land to drill the oil. So anytime you're drilling or logging or grazing public lands, you have lease fees that you have to pay to do that, because that money goes back to the federal government to help take care of the public lands that you're utilizing to make money off.
Yeah, so I just say that in case someone's listening that's, worried about high taxes, but maybe they like to go hunting or they like to go snowboarding or they like to go to the lake or hiking. Maybe a fiscally conservative person listening, that's money that's not really in the federal budget as far as I've read. It's not something that they're actually saving in the federal budget, correct, if they cut it?
Correct. Well, it's not appropriated through normal tax dollars, if that's the way that you're asking that.
Right.
So
it's not actually saving. It's not saving individual taxpayers any money if they cut this out of the budget.
Well, that's kind of my perspective, but I think I would give the only thing that I would maybe adjust there is that some people would argue, and I just want to be upfront with your listeners, because I think that it's a healthy debate, that if you didn't spend the $500 to $900 million every year on this type of land and water conservation fund for all this, you could spend that money somewhere else in the federal budget, and so therefore offset that cost. So let's just round it off to a close $1 billion. If you wanted to take that $1 billion and spend it somewhere else instead of spending it on this, my argument, to your listeners would be, and I'd love to take questions on this, is that the amount that what we're spending that $500 to $900 million on generates far more in both economic revenue and taxes and jobs, and that all goes into your local economies, much greater than anything you could spend that $1 billion on somewhere else. And so just in California, we have a $92 billion outdoor recreation industry with 690,000 plus jobs, and that's millions and millions of dollars in wages, obviously. And we collect over $6 billion in state and local taxes because of the outdoor economic outdoor industry, recreation industry just in California. So all of those impacts are huge, along with the economic benefits of that money and that investment in our public lands is also the value, we as Americans and we as local citizens in our local neighborhoods and communities get the benefit from that. And then on top of that, we're taking care of species, endangered species, and wildlife, and plant life, and habitat, and the biodiversity that's necessary for us to live in this place. We have one of the most beautiful states in the country and one of the most spectacular places in the world to live in California. And we have that because of all access to all this open land and this public lands that we can recreate and enjoy. Beaches to forests to lakes to rivers. And we wouldn't have all of that if government didn't invest in it. There's no way that private industry would be able to support the benefits and the long-term health of all of this public land. It's just not possible. That's one of the things that government can do well and has done a fairly good job at over decades. We're one of the few countries in the world that has a national park system like we do. And I travel all over the place, all over the world, and I've gone to many places that, they wish they would have protected some of their open lands and public spaces a century ago, and not have had it developed in many of these other countries. So, something to think about.
All of this kind of comes from the beginning of the park system when there weren't as many people in the U.S. and Teddy Roosevelt thinking ahead, even though he's a hunter. Absolutely. It's very interesting because he'd be very conservative and quite racist by today's standards, but as many people would be, especially presidents. He saw roads being built and tons of population boom, especially on the East Coast where there's not a lot of land. And he was like, wait a second, we need to slow this down. And we have these national parks because of the way that he set them up. But there's a lot of people that want to use those lands in other ways. And with this new administration and a lot of their more strong devotees in Congress, my suspicion is if they can take away the funding for maintaining some of these spaces, then years down the road, they can say, look, no one's even taking care of this space. Why don't we open it up for this use? Or why don't we open it up for this company to go look for something they could make money off of? And do you see that as like a double win-win for the people that want to cut this? That they would get to say they saved the money and then later on get to give those lands away to someone for profit because they're saying, hey, no one's taking care of these lands. We may as well have this private company do whatever with them.
Yeah, I wouldn't even say, Dan, that that's a suspected issue. I would say that it's actually true because we are already seeing in many places throughout the country and even here in California, like Big Bear down in Southern California, the reduction of the monument, of the national monument, and a smaller boundary line and so forth. So, we could have, a healthy debate as to what public lands we should keep public and what public lands can be used for, because there is a natural balance there in national forest, as well as Bureau of Land Management, Land BLM, as well as national monuments and national parks, as to what we use the land for. There's lots of my colleagues that would argue that you shouldn't use any of those lands or should use very little of those lands for extracting natural resources out of, right? But you have to look at the history. I mean, the history of the National Forest System was really to manage the lands, to manage the forest. And if you manage the forest well, and we've had that debate many times in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C. about how to do that, maybe we need to manage the forest differently now because of the wildfires and the climate change that we have. And that's, again, another healthy debate that we should have as to what our public land should be. My only request to stakeholders and elected officials or, let's say, political leaders that we have both here in the state as well as in Washington, D.C., is that we have it as an open dialogue, that I may be an optimist, but I trust and believe in democracy. And the only way that democracy works is to allow people to the table to be part of the conversation. You can't exclude certain groups of individuals because you don't like the position that they have on a topic. If you allow everyone to the table, there's going to be people that don't agree with you, and there's going to be people that the outcome is not going to benefit or they're not going to agree with. But that's part of the process. And I always say to many of my staff and many of the people I work with that are not in the political world, we have two choices. We either have a messy democracy or some totalitarian fascist government, right? And so democracy is not going to be very necessarily efficient and streamlined all the time, but it's the best system we have, and so we need to include everybody in that system, allow all the voices. So.
Now, other voices, ones that have been speaking out against this Land and Water Conservation Fund for a number of years now, claim that at the beginning it was to build infrastructure in existing parks and maintain existing parks, and that it's been used since then to acquire federal land, which they use as a buzzword to scare people, saying the government's going to take all your property. What would you say to people that are maybe believing that and maybe the priorities of how the money is used has changed over time? What would you say to people that use the argument that it's being used to acquire too much land rather than maintain existing and improve existing open spaces. Is that a genuine argument or a disingenuine argument?
From the very beginning of this fund, when it was set up in 1964, the part of land and water conservation, many times acquiring property to protect that property, that land, that water is necessary. And so protecting is also everything from setting it aside to be used by the public to allowing state and federal agencies to manage that land appropriately, and appropriately is open for discussion, right? That's part of the administrative process that agencies, both state and federal, go through to address how to manage some of these lands and waters. But from the very beginning, this fund had acquisition. I mean, there was one of the projects that I brought up to you earlier, the Twin Lakes project. That was 1969, and when they allocated the money to acquire that, so that beach could be set aside for public access. I mean, can you imagine in California if you had a checkerboard beach and we did it one time, right, back in the days, where there was private beaches and private lands that people owned out to the ocean, and you couldn't have public access to it. That has since changed with the public trust doctrines that we kind of have put into place and that we've enforced. And that public trust has been there since the very beginning when, like you referred to, when we set up the National Park Service and set up the state park systems and all these things that we have today. And we quite often take those for granted. You know, when we really think about what does it mean to acquire land, you don't have a lot of cases anymore of eminent domain where federal government or state governments are coming in and taking people's private property and converting them to public lands. That is extremely rare, if at all, anymore. You might have that happening on a local level when you're dealing with highways or public projects like that. Now, you have a lot of land conservation that's being flipped. So I've worked with a number of conservation groups, and especially land conservation groups, that will purchase somebody's private land. So they put it up for sale. The nonprofit or the organization, whatever they may be, raises the money and goes and acquires that private property, and then either stays the manager of that private property in terms of makes it into a land conservation or an easement, kind of conservation easement.
Right. There's a number of those. There's a number of those all over California where you see the names of families on there, and it's not because that person was a conservationist. Usually, like parts of Big Sur, I believe. Oh God, what is his name? It starts with an M. A huge part of Big Sur is named after a family, and it was a cattle rancher out here when no one else lived down there, and he was a really wealthy person that just raised cattle right there on the Big Sur coast. And I believe it was his sister or his daughter that sold it to the state eventually to become. And so you see these names of people on there, and you're like, wow, that person's a great conservationist. And in fact, it's a trust that runs the land, and they probably get some of the money often from the Land and Water Conservation Fund to help in those efforts, correct?
Correct. Yes, the Land and Water Conservation Fund has funded land acquisition through various land conservation groups over the years, and often those lands end up back in state or federal management systems. So BLM, Borough Land Management, or the state parks, or Bureau or national parks or national monuments, or that's often how many of these national monuments have been set up in the past. Where they acquire lots of these private lands to turn them into a national monument.
Right, and no one was able to go to, and I just looked it up. It's Andrew Malera. I wanted to say Madera, but yeah, Andrew Malera State Park is a huge part of Big Sur area. It's the northern end of Big Sur mostly, and no one would have been able to go to that beach if he still had cattle there. He wouldn't want people going to the beach and hiking around in the woods and stuff, but now we can do that because of these funds. So what I hear you saying is you're not opposed to debates on how the money can be used, but you're asking them to vote on this before September 30th to make sure that the money still exists, correct?
Correct. And the best thing that your listeners can do is contact their congressional member and write a letter, send them an email, call their office. The best thing is to do it in writing. So either send them an email or write them a letter and specifically request for them to vote yes on the bills that are supporting the funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And again, that website, lwcf.com, has information on the bills and the funding and who your congressional members are. So if you don't know who your congressional member is, you want to look it up. You can type in your zip code and tell you who your congressional member is.
And we live in a very interesting area, yourself in San Francisco and me in Santa Cruz, in the fact of like writing your congressional representative is an interesting thing to promote, because really the people that are just east of us have some of the most staunch Tea Party representatives at this point. Devin Nunes in Fresno and all those things. And a lot of those people might not realize that their representatives are some of the ones fighting against funding this, but they probably love going to a lot of the state parks like the Eastern Sierras and Big Sur and all these places as much as anyone else. And how do you get through to people that maybe support a very, very staunch opponent of this for other reasons, that they should maybe hassle them about funding this particular bill?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because as we started off this conversation, Dan, that this is extremely bipartisan. This is one of the things that has been very bipartisan for many decades. It doesn't matter what your political orientation or walk of life is. Everybody uses some amount of the land and the water that this fund has taken care of, protected, helps manage, helps invest in over the decades. And so you're right. People that live in these districts, in these congressional districts, that may have a congressional member that is not supporting funding this because they're using it as a political football, or they don't want to spend this money on this and they want to spend it on something else. People in those districts are benefiting from the investment from this fund. And so it's important. It's really important for congressional members. I don't know how many times I've been out to D.C. meeting with Congress members that have told me, Howard, if you can get me 50 letters from my district, from my constituents that vote for me, that care about this issue, I'll put it up on my priority list. And I hear that over and over again, that the congressional members need to hear from their constituents on what is important to them. Because otherwise they're sitting in this bubble out in D.C. listening to, people like me, that my living is advocating and trying to get them to do certain things. And they really want to hear from their voters. They want to hear from the people that live in their congressional districts on what they care about. So if you have family members or friends or colleagues that live in another congressional district, especially the congressional districts in the Central Valley and Southern California, inland Southern California area, encourage them to write letters to their congressional member and get them to vote on this. Because most likely the congressional members along Santa Cruz and Monterey and Big Sur area, they're probably supporting this.
Absolutely.
Most of the coastal areas in California are represented by, fairly progressive, Democrat-oriented congressional members. And so aside from San Diego and up far north, those congressional members are supporting this. We've got to get the congressional members inland to support this as well.
This is something that is really interesting about California, and you have to always remind yourself, if you live in any part of California, that it's not just your area that represents it, because, Santa Cruz, we stick stickers all over our cars saying we're from Santa Cruz, and, everyone knows where we're from. And Santa Cruz, San Francisco, Fresno, Modesto, these areas are exactly the reason why this Land Water Conservation Fund both exists and why it's in danger so much, because we have some of the most far liberal, most environmentalist Congress people, and then we have some of the furthest on the other end in the same state. And it's very interesting how much can be done just by talking to probably a relative that lives 50 miles away from you.
And because of the place that you live, Santa Cruz and then that coastal area, and especially even in San Jose and some of those areas, and San Francisco, the Bay Area, you have lots of younger, students that come to Santa Cruz that are from out of state. And so depending on where they're registered to vote, or depending on where their family lives, influencing family members that might live in the Midwest or live in a rocky state or live on the East Coast or the Southeast that have Republican representation. And like we've been saying, this is very bipartisan. A lot of this is encouraging congressional members to continue to do something that's happened for so long. And what will happen, and we've seen this before in the past, that if this doesn't pass and this money is not appropriated for years moving forward for the immediate future, and many of these state parks and local projects that are getting money from this fund shrink and go away totally, there will be loud voices.
Now,
one of the things that we're working on, the 600 organizations plus that are working on this coalition, is to get the word out about this. We really haven't had to do this type of major national outreach across the country for this fund as much as we have this time, because it hasn't been threatened to the extent that it is now. And people won't really know what they're missing until it's not there.
On scorecard.lcv.org, what is this group?
League of Conservation Voters.
It is, yes, League of Conservation Voters. Thank you. They have a vote count from 2016 that went against this. 205 to 212. 212 voted against it in the House of Representatives. And 17 people in the House of Representatives did not vote on it.
Okay.
Why do you feel, from the people you talk to, with this strong polarization on these issues, are these Democrats from conservative areas, or are these Republicans who don't want to look like extremists against this type of funding? And how do you sway those? How do you sway those non-voting members? Because that would actually change that into a yes vote. And did this vote in 2016 cause the Land and Water Conservation Fund to expire at that point?
No, they fixed that funding, that vote. Without getting into back history of those years with, again, political football. You have to remember we had a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, so a lot of those types of votes were being used as leverage to get something else. Exactly what's going on now, which is really interesting, seeing as it's one party that has both branches. But there's enough
theoretically.
Yeah, theoretically, there's enough support for this, even within the Republican delegates, that it's made it more challenging. And so the scenario posing one funding source or one funding opportunity to get something else to be funded. I mean, let's be honest here. Most of the funding, and not all, but a lot of the funding votes and choices that are going through Congress right now are being put up against funding the wall. And there's so much pushback on doing that, both within the Democratic Party, obviously, but even within the Republican Party, that leveraging these types of funding opportunities against something like that. I'm not saying that that's absolutely what's happening here. There's a lot that happens with these funding. I obviously don't know everything that goes on in the Capitol because I'm not in D.C. all the time. But
no one knows.
My colleagues that are in D.C. work the Capitol and are in there all the time. That's the problem with much of this funding nowadays. It's being put up against other funding needs or desires, I should say, that are getting leverage, and that's one of the big ones. There's obviously lots of other big funding levers being pulled on this type of stuff. So, and we don't necessarily have an administration right now that is receptive to public lands. I mean, one of the things that was put out in the campaign even was about how we spend all this money on taking care of our public lands across the country, and maybe we should be downsizing those and selling those off or leasing them off to private enterprises. There's been conversations in the Department of Interior and elsewhere in the administration about basically privatizing the National Park Service.
Yes.
Allowing Yosemite and Yellowstone and Glacier National Park and all these other national parks to be run by whatever corporation, Disney or MGM or whoever, right? Whoever wants to take it over and run them, and not have them managed by the federal government, but have them managed by a private company that you're leasing it back to. I'm not a big fan of that. I don't think that we should be taking the natural assets of our country and leveraging that for private gain, and that private corporations should be making money out of that and then giving a portion of that back to the federal government. It's not like Yosemite and Yellowstone are not like the oil and gas leases, offshore oil, gas, and leases. Those are different, where you've got access to the beaches and to the oceans now. Whether you agree or disagree with offshore oil drilling is a different conversation. But the fact that that's happening, or the fact that we're grazing cattle on national forest land and that rancher is paying a lease to do that, part of grazing, part of responsible and sustainable land management is using all of those opportunities to manage the land, right? To keep the fire fuel reduction down, to keep the grasses managed. And so there's good and bad. Nothing's perfect. But handing over Yosemite or Yellowstone to Disney would not, in my perspective, be a good thing.
Coming into the last couple minutes here, again, where would you direct people to get involved? And like a 30-second redo on that, where would they go to learn more about this? And what would you recommend and where they go to get involved in this if they want to continue this funding, and maybe the deadline for it?
So it's lwcfcoalition.com. Stands for Land and Water Coalition Fund. Conservation Fund. So lwcfcoalition.com. That's the best website to go to. That's the coalition website that we're all working with to get this information out. On that site has all the information about the funding, the proposed legislation. You can find out who your congressional member is and contact them. This is really about getting your friends, your family, your colleagues, people that you know in other places in the state of California and even in yours and other places in the country to write their congressional member and tell them how important this is. And if you look at the list of projects that are funded, and in your letter or your email can give a personal story of hiking or biking or swimming or climbing or whatever in one of those parks that was funded by this, those are the types of personal stories that congressional members like to hear. And they do make an impact. I've got to say this again. So many times of being out there at the Capitol, the congressional members will tell me over and over again, I read those letters and I listen to my constituents. So if you're in that congressional member's district and you write them a letter about this mattering to you, that it matters to you, they will take it into account. And the more letters that are written, the more impact it has.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Howard Penn, Executive Director of the Planning and Conservation League. Have a great day, man. Thank you so much. And this has been Unquestionable. Dan Wu, I didn't get to ask him how it felt when Donald Trump donated his first paycheck to the National Park Service after cutting billions of dollars from their funding, but we'll have to save that for another day. Thank you so much. This has been Unquestionable. I'll take this call off the air. You just missed the show, but thank you so much for listening. KZSE Santa Cruz, Unquestionable, out of here.